Your Honors, this is case IT-0992T, the prosecutor versus Ratko Mladich.
Thank you, Madam Magister. Could I have the appearances, prosecution first?
Good morning, Your Honors. I am Dermot Groom, and also with me here today are Peter McCluskey, Maxine Marcus, Rulin Boss, and Ms. Janet Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Groom. For the defense.
Good morning, Your Honors. I'm Branko Lukic, and this morning with me is Mr. Miodrag Stojanovic, Mr. Miloš Šaljić, and Mr. Radovan Đurđević.
Thank you, Mr. Lukic, and Mr. Mladic is present as well. Before the Chamber will hear the opening statement of the prosecution, the Chamber first would like to deliver a statement. On the 3rd of May, the Chamber issued a decision denying two defense requests for the postponement of trial and stated that written reasons for the decision would follow. The Chamber is currently in the process of drafting the document in which it presents the reasons for its decision. On the 11th of May, that is last Friday, the Chamber was unpleasantly surprised by information from the prosecution received through an informal communication between the parties concerning a very significant disclosure error by the prosecution. This error could have an impact on the defense's ability to prepare for the prosecution's presentation of evidence. On that same day, the Chamber immediately instructed the prosecution to respond to a series of questions intended to clarify the scope and potential impact of the error. On the 14th of May, the prosecution responded. However, this response did not provide the Chamber with all the information needed as to the full extent of the problem or as to what concrete steps had been taken to repair the error. On that same day, the Chamber was seized of a new motion from the defense seeking an adjournment of the trial. In light of this new information, the Chamber informs the parties that it is in the process of determining whether to reconsider its 3rd of May decision denying the defense's request for adjournment, or whether other remedial steps may be necessary. In this respect, it should not come as a surprise if this new information would affect the start of the presentation of the prosecution's evidence. Further, the Chamber is in the process of determining what additional information it still requires from the parties and will communicate with them on this matter in the very near future. Finally, for the transparency of the record, the prosecution is instructed to immediately file its correspondence of the 11th of May and its 14th of May informal response, attaching both without any alterations as annexes to the filing. Mr. Groom, the prosecution indicated that it would file its response to the defense's motion, which was filed on the 14th of May, that you intended to file your response, I think already yesterday. Has it been filed or not?
Your Honor, there have been several filings. If you could please indicate the title of it, I'll be able to answer.
Yes, it's the response to the latest defense motion for a delay of the start of the trial.
Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution yesterday evening did file a response, and in essence, the prosecution accepts that and recognizes that this error does impact the possible ability of Mr. Lukic and the defense to prepare. The prosecution's position is that it is not opposing a reasonable adjournment for the commencement of the evidential portion of the trial.
Thank you. Then there's no need to set any deadline for a response anymore. I'll move on. The Chamber also has considered whether the very unfortunate error should have an effect on the hearing of the prosecution's opening statement. In view of the fact that the defense had decided not to make any statement at this stage of the proceedings, the Chamber decided that hearing the prosecution's opening statement would not cause any prejudice to the defense, and this concludes the Chamber's statement. I would like further to put on the record at this moment that the Chamber, in an informal communication, granted a request by the prosecution to slightly go beyond the 6 hours the Chamber granted for the opening statement. Mr. Groom, is the prosecution ready to make its opening statement?
It is, Your Honor.
Then you may proceed.
Your Honors, 2 decades ago this past month, Bosnian Serb leaders commenced an attack on their fellow citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Civilians who were targeted for no other reason than they were of an ethnicity other than Serb. Their land, their lives, their dignity attacked in a coordinated and carefully planned manner. In some locations, this attack arose to the level of genocide. The world watched in disbelief that in neighborhoods and villages within Europe, a genocide appeared to be in progress. 4 days ago marked 2 decades since Ratko Mladich became the commander of the main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska, the VRS, an army created, at least in name, on that day. On that day, Mladich began his full participation in a criminal endeavor that was already in progress. On that day, he assumed the mantle of realizing through military might the criminal goals of ethnically cleansing much of Bosnia. On that day, he commenced his direct involvement in serious international crimes. Elfiden Pasic was 14 years old the last time he saw his father. He and other children were forced onto buses with their mothers and driven away. His father and over 150 men were held behind in a school. Their ordeal started sometime earlier when their central Bosnian village was overrun by Serb forces. Elfidin's father and older brother had joined a group of men who tried to resist these forces, while Elfidin and his mother moved from village to village seeking refuge. Eventually, they made their way to an enclave of other Muslims, one of the few places able to offer resistance. Mladić's army of the Republic of Srpska eventually surrounded and choked the enclave, closing tighter and tighter around it. On some occasions, Muslim fighters conducted ambushes from the town. One day, the population was given an ultimatum issued by Mladić himself. They were told that they could leave but no one would be allowed to leave until there was a complete and unconditional surrender of weapons. After the ultimatum was given, Elveden overheard his mother and father talk about plans for men to escape through the woods. They agreed that Elveden's best chance of survival was to go into the woods with his father. A large group of fighters, interspersed with women and children, walked into the forest that night. They were soon ambushed and dispersed among the trees. Elveden, his father, his uncle, and others were eventually captured and led to a local school. They were stripped of their identification papers and valuables. Soldiers eventually came and told the women and children to get up. Elveden did not. He remained next to his father. His father told him, "Get up, go with the women and children. You might survive if you do." Elveden left in a bus with the women and children and never saw his father again. His father, uncle, other relations, and the remaining Muslim men, hands bound with wire, were murdered. Your Honors, what happened to the people of Vetchici that day in November 1992, the killing of over 150 men and forced removal of their families, would be repeated. By the time Mladich and his troops would murder thousands in Srebrenica 3 years later, they were well rehearsed in the craft of murder, proficient in the forcible removal of non-Serb civilians. Slide 2 is a record of Mladich's ultimatum to the people of Vetchici. And if Your Honors push the e-court button, you'll be able to have the clearest picture of the slides that I will refer to. Quote, "The extraordinary session of the War Presidency continued with Colonel Bogievich informing all present that he had received explicit orders from General Mladich that no one was to be allowed to leave Vetchici until the unconditional surrender of weapons was completed." Unquote. While Srebrenica was different in scale, it was not different in its intent. It was not different in its utter inhumanity. After the fall of Srebrenica in July 1995, Dino Selilovic, a tall, lanky 16-year-old boy, was one of thousands of Muslim men and boys put to death. He wasn't a soldier, he was a boy. Brought to Turnovo in a military truck. He was murdered by members of the infamous Scorpion Unit. One of them recorded the killing on video. Dino was taunted by his murderers that he would die a virgin. Dino didn't run, didn't scream, didn't cry. We watched this young man with dignity and resignation walk forward, hands bound behind his back, standing momentarily until the camera was trained on him. We watch a burst of gunfire tear through his back. Slide 3 is an excerpt of RM 255's evidence. He was a survivor of the massacres at Branjevo Farm on the 16th of July. Monday, the 28th of August, 1995, was a clear summer day with a light breeze blowing over Sarajevo. It was late morning, and Sarajevo's shopping district along Mullah Mustafa Bashakia Street was crowded with people buying groceries. Just after 11 that morning, a shell landed in front of the indoor marketplace known as Markali. This was the second time in the war this crowded market was targeted. Panic ensued. Dozens of people lay dead on the street. Unsure of who was dead and who was injured, passers-by ferried the victims to the hospital in the trunks of cars. Over 30 died. Over 70 were wounded. A witness will give evidence of the following quote: "When I got to that place, or rather a few steps before, I saw a great mess and commotion. There was blood all over the place, flowing in the streets, bits of human flesh scattered around, bits of clothing torn and scattered all over, shoes mostly torn off the feet. Common to these crimes is the fact that they were all related to an overarching criminal purpose, an endeavor defined in paragraphs 8 to 10 of the indictment to permanently remove Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat inhabitants from the territories claimed by Bosnian Serb leaders. Common to them all are the individuals who participated in these crimes and shared a common intent to commit them. Common to them all is their fact that they are some of the crimes of General Ratko Mladich. The prosecution will present evidence that will show, beyond reasonable doubt, the hand of Mr. Mladich in each of these crimes. To understand Mladich's crimes, it is necessary to provide some context regarding the conflict and what transpired in the 6 weeks prior to his installation as commander of the VRS main staff. The tensions that fueled the breakup of Yugoslavia and the terrible inter-ethnic violence that followed are still a subject of debate. A debate that lies outside the task that the trial chamber begins today. I will spend little time on them here. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was formed as a federal state after World War II and was comprised of 6 constituent republics. While some of these republics were largely ethnically homogeneous, such as Slovenia, others, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, had large populations which were ethnically diverse. In the late 1980s and early 90s, questions of independence and the future of the Yugoslav Union were openly discussed. The debate raised important questions regarding the future of all people in Yugoslavia. Mr. Mladich is a Bosnian Serb. From the perspective of Serbs living in Bosnia, independence raised a number of concerns and fears. To understand them, it is essential to understand the ethnic composition of Bosnia prior to the conflict. Slide 6 is a demographic map of Bosnia from 1991. It indicates the majority ethnic population in different municipalities using colors. Municipalities with a majority of Bosnian Serbs are indicated in red. The darker the shade of red, the greater the majority. Municipalities with a majority of Bosnian Muslims are indicated in green. Again, the darker the shade of green, the greater the majority. Bosnians of Croat ethnicity are represented in blue. In the former Yugoslavia, most people of Serb ethnicity lived in Serbia proper. Having said this, there were very significant and vibrant Serbian populations within Bosnia and within Croatia. Serbs who lived on and worked that land for generations. In Bosnia alone, the 1991 census tells us that Serbs made up approximately 31% of the overall population, with Muslims making up approximately 44%. Ethnic Croats made up approximately 17%. In the simplest terms, the characteristic which made Bosnia unique among Yugoslavia's republics, and which must be understood, is that Bosnia was composed of large areas of ethnic concentrations that were somewhat disconnected from other areas of the same ethnic group. Some communities resembling large ethnic islands in a surrounding sea of a different ethnic group. In other areas, different ethnic groups were present in equal or near equal numbers, living in diverse communities. This made any discussion of Bosnia's independence a difficult and polarizing subject. From the perspective of a Bosnian Serb in an independent Bosnia and Herzegovina that maintained its borders as they existed in Yugoslavia, would result in several things. First, it would take people of Serb ethnicity and divide them into separate ethnic minority communities in Bosnia and Croatia. For the nation of Serbs who suffered during World War II, the prospect was unacceptable and raised in them a sense of fear and vulnerability. Second, along the eastern border of Bosnia, we can see that there are significant populations of both Muslim and Serb ethnicities. An independent Bosnia would turn a republican border between Serb communities living in Yugoslavia into an international border between sovereign states. The three ethnic nations of Bosnia, Muslim, Serb, and Croat, were simply inextricable. This inextricability was something Mladich himself fully appreciated. On the day he became the commander of the main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska, he said, quote, "People and peoples are not pawns, nor are they keys in one's pocket that can be shifted from here to there. It is something easily said, but difficult to achieve." Unquote. He knew from the outset that with the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the project to create a Bosnian Serb state was not a matter of shifting a pair of keys from one's left pocket to one's right. It was a matter of shifting entire communities, entire ethnicities from their land from their home. Prior to the outbreak of conflict in Bosnia, Mr. Mladich had been the commander of the 9th Corps of the Yugoslav People's Army, or the JNA, based in Knin, Croatia, the place where the first ethnic cleansing of the Yugoslav crisis took place. During the 1980s, communist political systems began to break down. As the democracy began to find its first steps in Bosnia, something unfortunate happened. Political parties were formed along ethnic lines. When the political discourse of Yugoslavia's future was framed in ethnic terms, each of Bosnia's ethnic groups felt vulnerable. Each felt uncertain about their future. The Serbian Democratic Party, or SDS party, led by Radovan Karadzic, was an active and robust party. It maintained a rigid hierarchical structure, Karadzic at the top, heading an organization that reached down to the rural towns of Bosnia. The SDS was also a party with very close ties to the President of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic was not only Karadzic's mentor and supporter, but was an ardent believer in the need for Serbs in Yugoslavia to resist any effort to dissolve Yugoslavia in a way that left Serbs living in separate states. As the momentum for Bosnia's independence grew, and the prospect of maintaining an integral Yugoslavia dissipated, Milosevic, Karadzic, and others considered other options. Options that involve the creation of Serb entities by force. Under Milosevic's tutelage and with his participation, Serbs living in Croatia were the first to declare autonomous regions and begin the process of ethnically cleansing land they considered Serb. As the positions of the different parties became more resolute, as the language of their leaders more provocative, more inflammatory, more intractable, the fires of fear among the population were ignited. Bosnian Serb leaders mobilized Serbs who had long lived in diverse communities with lies and rhetoric that aroused the most primal instinct of survival. Slide 8 is a publication from Sanski Most. It states, quote, "Do you know what our bloodthirsty enemies have been scheming for us? What they had in mind was to gouge out our eyes and carve us up, hack our bodies to pieces, rape women and girls in front of their dearest, to circumcise, to destroy our religion, to crush us, just because we happen to be Serbs. Don't think that anybody's family would have been spared," unquote. Although this was published after the conflict was underway, it demonstrates the inflammatory character of some of the rhetoric that was used. Such rhetoric had little or no connection to actual events and was purposefully disseminated by leaders in an irresponsible effort to mobilize peaceful people by frightening them. The situation became more volatile. Radovan Karadzic and Bosnian Serb leaders created a dangerous situation when they equated the protection of Bosnian Serbs with the ethnic destruction of the Muslim and Croat populations living in areas they considered essential to preserve Serb interests. In October 1991, the Bosnian Assembly met to deliberate and to discuss a memorandum of independence. Karadzic, in clear terms, told the Assembly what would happen if they proceeded further toward independence. I will ask Ms. Stewart to play the video of what he said.
Ovo je put na koji vi hoćete da izvedete Bosnu i Hercegovinu, ista ona autostrada pakla i stradanja kojom su pošli Slovenija i Hrvatska. Nemojte da mislite da nećete odvesti Bosnu i Hercegovinu u pakao, a muslimanski narod možda u nestanak. Jer muslimanski narod ne može da se odbrani ako bude rat ovdje.
3 days prior to giving this speech, Karadzic told Gojko Joko that, quote, they do not understand that there would be bloodshed and that the Muslim people would be exterminated. In this conversation, he tells Jogo that there are 4,000 armed Serbs in Bosnia, 20,000 of them in Sarajevo, and that Sarajevo itself will become a cauldron where 300,000 Muslims will die. I ask if Ms. Stewart would advance the slide that has this intercepted conversation. Karadzic envisaged the creation of a new Bosnian Serb state. The plan to achieve this had two essential components that can be traced throughout what happened next. First, the plan had a territorial or geographic component. Land had been identified for this Bosnian Serb state. Land which, if necessary, would be seized by force. Second, the plan had an ethnic or demographic component. The Bosnian Serb state would be one which essentially physically separated Serbs from other ethnicities. What was the land that the Bosnian Serbs intended to take by force if necessary? Here on slide 11, we have a photo of Momcilo Krajisnik, president of the Bosnian Serb Assembly, giving a press conference in which he defines the territorial ambitions of the Bosnian Serbs. The map depicts the territory held in the takeover by late 1992. This is the horseshoe-shaped area that consumes most of Bosnia. To better understand the import of what Krajisnik is saying here, we need to take a look at the ethnic map of Bosnia and Herzegovina too. You can see here in rough terms what Bosnian Serb leaders wanted to change. Brown circles indicate the corresponding areas on the two maps. The upper one lies within what is often referred to as the Posavina corridor. Many of the Bosnians that live here were of Muslim or Croat ethnicity, represented by the green and blue areas, respectively. On Krajisnik's map, the map created by the Bosnian Serb leadership, this entire area is claimed as Serb. Similarly, the brown circles at the right of each map indicate areas in eastern Bosnia that were occupied by significant Muslim populations in 1991. They are also considered to be Serb lands. To change reality on the ground to look like Krajisnik's map on the right, the Bosnian Serb leaders chose to ethnically cleanse the territory, to forcibly remove non-Serb peoples from their homes and lands. The Bosnian Serb leadership gave Mladic a mandate to carve the boundaries of Krajisnik's map onto the countryside of Bosnia. For these geographic and demographic aspirations to become a reality, the Bosnian Serb leadership needed to create a new state the international community would recognize. On 14 April 1995, at the Bosnian Serb Assembly, Mladic reminded the attendees of this principle, how this would be done. On slide 13, he says, quote, "Thus imposed by the force of arms, the final settlement of the war on the enemy, and place the international community in a position of having to recognize the actual situation in the field and end the war." Later in this opening, I will play a video which recorded Mladic's thoughts on a number of issues that are relevant in this trial. It was recorded by a member of the Serbian diaspora that visited Mladic in Bosnia. The video in this opening, I will play a video which recorded Mladic's thoughts on a number of issues that are relevant in this trial. It was recorded by a member of the Serbian diaspora that visited Mladic in Bosnia. The video includes the following dialogue. Mladic, quote, "The ball is in our hands. Whoever holds the territory also draws the maps. Film what I am telling you. Lesic, I am filming everything. Mladic, whoever holds the territory also draws the maps. And the people and its army have drawn the maps of Republika Srpska." Unquote. Drawing the new boundaries of a Bosnian Serb state, populating it with Serbs was an ambitious undertaking. The aspirations underlying Krajisnik's map were formulated into concrete strategic objectives. Objectives which would first be advanced by Bosnian Serb leaders through the police, paramilitaries, territorial defense or reserve forces, and elements of the JNA, the Yugoslav People's Army. In time with the formation of a Bosnian Serb army, these strategic objectives would form the basis of most military operations. They were first publicly announced at the 16th session of the Bosnian Serb Assembly held on the 12th of May, 1992. The same day the VRS was established and Ratko Mladic was installed as the commander of the main staff. Different trial chambers in the tribunal have drawn different conclusions about whether these strategic objectives were in themselves illegal. While the question of their inherent legality remains open for debate, the fact that the implementation of the objectives involved the commission of serious crimes is clear. I will now enumerate these goals. As I do, I would ask that you recall the two aspirations of Bosnian Serb leaders, the geographic or temporal or territorial aspiration, and the second, the ethnic or demographic aspiration. The first objective, shown here on slide 15, is the separation of the Serbian people from the other two national communities. As Karadzic would explain at the May 12th Assembly session, quote, "The first goal is separation from the other two national communities, separation of states, separation from those who are our enemies and have used every opportunity, especially in this century, to attack us, and who would continue with such practices if we were to stay together in the same state." Unquote. This objective was the central demographic component of all the remaining objectives. As Krajisnik would say at the same assembly, this was the most important goal. The rest were in fact subsets of this goal. Also included on slide 15 is a smaller image of the demographic map of Bosnia in 1991 from slide 6. The first strategic objective was in essence to radically reconfigure the ethnic distribution of the civilian population in Bosnia so that all of the areas targeted in the remaining 5 goals would appear in dark red on this map. 2. Establishment of a corridor between Semberia and Krajina. The areas targeted by this goal were referred to as the Posavina corridor. This objective would create the land bridge between Serbs in western Bosnia, the Krajina areas, with Serb areas in eastern Bosnia. A necessary and vital goal because the Serb Krajina could only be sustained if it was physically connected to Serb communities to the east. Slide 16 illustrates this with 2 maps. On the left is the demographic map. On the right is a map of the strategic objectives. In simple terms, the goal was to connect the large red area at the left side of the demographic map to the red areas in eastern Bosnia and Serbia proper, again to the east. As you can see, the territory lying between these 2 areas is both green and blue, representing the Bosnian Muslim and the Bosnian Croat people who were in a majority there. To achieve the second goal, this area, populated primarily by people of non-Serb ethnicity, would be forcibly taken from their lands, and the population would be forcibly removed or killed. Strategic Objective 3, shown here on slide 17, was the establishment of a corridor in the Drina Valley, eliminating the Drina River as a boundary between Serbs. This corridor was really a large expanse of territory comprising most of eastern Bosnia. Again, the demographic map on the left assists in understanding the implications of this goal. Serbia proper would be to the right of Bosnia. To establish an ethnically pure corridor would require taking control over all of the municipalities in eastern Bosnia. As you can see, several of them have a majority population that was Muslim. Slide 18 shows the 4th strategic objective, establishing a border on the Una and the Neretva rivers. Again, when considered alongside the demographic map, we can see this goal set to establish borders here also contemplated the forcible takeover of and ethnic cleansing of land. Slide 19 depicts the fifth and sixth strategic objectives of the Bosnian Serb leadership. The fifth goal was the division of Sarajevo. There is little dispute that Sarajevo was a model of diversity. Different peoples, ethnic groups, and religions living in harmony in a modern cosmopolitan city. The fifth strategic goal sought to destroy this, to sever the city in half, with Serbs living in one part and non-Serbs in the other. While Bosnian Serb leaders held to the notion of ethnic division for the city, they soon realized that their stranglehold on the city represented an important strategic advantage. The campaign of terror that was visited upon Sarajevo was an effective tool, an effective political lever, a pressure point Bosnian Serb leaders would use throughout the conflict. The sixth and final strategic objective was providing the Serbs with access to the sea. The six strategic objectives was the mandate Mladic was given as commander of the main staff. As he would say, quote, the tasks of the army in this war stem from the known six strategic objectives adopted by our assembly, unquote. The events in Bosnia are as complex as they are terrible. In addition to the six strategic objectives providing a framework for the crimes, they also provide a conceptual insight into Mr. Mladic's state of mind. They help to understand the motivation behind specific operations and crimes. Although the six strategic goals were publicly announced on the 12th of May, 1992, there is evidence that they were formulated earlier. We know this from the words and writings of some participants, and we know because the offensive against the civilian population that started in April and continued unabated until their announcement followed a pattern which appears to have been guided by the same goals. On the day they were announced, Mladic spoke about the role he played in their development. Quote, please let us not set before ourselves goals that will bring us down. Let us set before ourselves the goals we can achieve. I have read, mulled over for a long time, and discussed within the most select circle of comrades whom we convened the strategic goals that are of substance, unquote. I would like to now show you a series of notebook entries written in Mladic's own hand that recorded at least some of these discussions. These notebooks were recovered from his family home in Belgrade by police that were searching for him. His contemporaneous notes of events will be an important source of evidence in this case. Slide 21 is an entry from the 5th of May, 1992. In it, Mladic records a number of items under a double underlined heading of questions, possibly questions he wishes to raise at a meeting. At this point in time, final preparations are being made to transform part of the JNA into a Bosnian Serb army, and Mladić is in the final discussions about his appointment as commander. His first question is the character and name of the Bosnian Serb army. His second is what are its war objectives. His third and fourth questions concern the relationship of the Bosnian Serb army will be towards the territory and the non-Serbian people inhabiting the territory. I would note that in Mladić's numbered list, he has 2 items marked as number 1. The top one also has an insertion mark, perhaps indicating that he added this item to the top of the list after he had written the other 3. In slide 22, Mladić records his discussion of the strategic objectives with Karadzic on May 6th. In this entry, he records Karadzic discussing the first 3 objectives as well as the 6th. Quote, "It would be good to carry out the demarcation, A, in order for us to separate, B, for us to form a corridor, C, for the Drina not to be the border, D, to reach the coast," unquote. Mladić's entry from the next day, now on slide 23, 5 days before the official announcement of the strategic objective, Mladić records Krajisnik setting out the strategic objectives. Mr. Mladić records in his notebook a near to final version of the strategic objectives, which will be announced in a few days, and he will be given the responsibility of completing the realization of them. To reinforce the importance of the strategic objectives to Mladić's military planning, I would ask you to view slide 24. It is an excerpt from a report of the VRS dated the 1st of April, 1993. It is entitled, quote, "Analysis of Combat Readiness and Activities," unquote. And it contains detailed analysis of Army operations. It says, quote, "The strategic objectives of our war, which were promptly defined and set before the main staff of the Army of the RS, the commands and units, served as a general guideline upon which we planned the actual operations and concerted battles," unquote. Slide 25 is an order from General Momir Talić to the members of the 1st Krajina Corps, the corps principally charged with realizing the 2nd strategic objective. Here, Talić orders new conscripts be informed of the goals of our struggle when they arrive. As I have said, there is evidence that the goals underlying the strategic objectives formed the basis of the attack on Bosnia prior to the Bosnian Serb leaders publishing the formal objectives themselves. I'm going to summarize a few key events before that attack and then give the Chamber an overview of it. In December 1991, a planning document for the establishment of Serb governmental authority in municipalities was disseminated. In February of 1992, Momčilo Mandić, Micho Stanisic, and other senior Serb members of the then multi-ethnic Bosnian police met to plan the dissolution of the Ministry of Interior and the creation of a Bosnian Serb Ministry of Interior to replace it. On the 24th of March 1992, about 8 days before the first attacks began, Radovan Karadzic told those present at the 12th Bosnian Serb Assembly that the plans that had been put in place could be implemented in the coming few days. Quote, "We have a legal basis in the law on internal affairs, and we also have the insignia, and at a desired moment, and this will be very soon, we can form whatever we want. There are reasons why this could happen in 2 or 3 days. Such are the forecasts, but I cannot tell you the reasons now." At that moment, all the Serbian municipalities, both the old ones and the newly established ones, would literally assume control of the entire municipality concerned. Unquote. On the 31st of March 1992, Mandić would send a dispatch to all levels of the joint interethnic police, declaring that that police force was abolished and that a new Bosnian Serb one had been established. That night, the infamous paramilitary group known as Arkan's Tigers crossed over the border from Serbia and took control of the town of Bijeljina. Placing large areas of Bosnia under Serb control was only possible through careful planning and coordinated implementation. To appreciate the level of coordination behind the takeovers and its connection to the aspirations of Bosnian Serb leaders, it is helpful to first take a cursory look at a simple animated time map that shows how the takeover of Bosnian municipalities progressed over the spring and summer of 1992. The takeover process began when Arkan's Tigers entered Bijeljina on the night between the 31st of March and the 1st of April. The takeover process continued through that first week. In that week, over a dozen municipalities would be placed under Serb control. While some of those municipalities, such as Tito Devar, were predominantly Serb, and control was simply asserted by switching allegiance from Sarajevo to Pale, in other municipalities, armed force and the commission of crimes were used to seize control. The darker shade of red is used to indicate municipalities that are the subject of the indictment. During the second week, the focus of the takeovers would remain on the Drina Valley, focused on places like Visegrad, Foča, and Šekovići. Arkan would move south to Zvornik. In the third week, takeovers continued along the Drina River, with Bratanac and Kalinovic coming under control. Vagošća, part of the greater Sarajevo area, would come under Serb control. The division and encirclement of Sarajevo was almost complete. During the fourth week, Serb control was asserted in Mrkonjić Grad and large parts of Bosanska Krupa, bringing the border of Serb-controlled lands to the banks of the Una River. The campaign in the Drina Valley continued with the takeover of Lasenica. By the end of April, 35 municipalities would be under Serb control, an average of over one municipality per day. Slide 32 shows the status of takeovers before Mr. Mladic's installation as the commander of the VRS main staff. By this time, the initial takeover of territory was largely complete. From this point forward, Mladic and the Bosnian Serb army, with the Bosnian Serb police, will solidify the gains of the initial offensive and systematically realize the most important strategic objective, the first, the separation of the ethnicities, ethnic cleansing. Slide 33 depicts what Mladic accomplished in the first 2 weeks at the helm of the main staff. There were significant bombardments of non-Serb areas in Prijedor. Members of the VRS would perpetrate serious crimes, including massacres in Sanski Most. Detention camps would be established in Omarska, Ternopoli, as well as in Vlasenica, Rogatica, Alija, and Foča. Before the end of May 1992, Mladic would be directly involved in a massive bombardment of Sarajevo. You will now notice the map includes references to the scheduled crimes in the indictment. The reference that is indicated in red indicates that the crime occurred during that particular period. June would start with another major bombardment of Sarajevo by Mladic. Significant massacres continued in the municipalities. Thousands of families were being forced from their land. In July, the VRS would participate in some of the most brutal ethnic cleansing in Prijedor. Terror continued at Omarska, Karaterm, and Ternopoli, and a new detention facility opened in Mishka Glava. On the 6th of July, an ammunition warehouse located in Mladic's hometown would be converted into another detention facility. During August, the killings, detentions, and forcible removal of persons continued. Some of the crimes are included in the indictment. The last slide shows the progress toward the strategic goals by the end of November, the period covered by the indictment. The schedules to the indictment describe 57 specific crimes perpetrated during this period that the prosecution asserts Mr. Mladic is responsible for. Two of the maps you see on the screen in slide 38 are demographic maps. One from 1991, before the campaign, and one from 1997, after the campaign. There is also a copy of Krajisnik's map. Here, the success of the attack on the non-Serb population of Bosnia can be measured statistically in the dramatic demographic changes. If you look along the Posavina corridor, objective 2, that is the horizontal oval at the top of the map. the target of the second strategic goal, you will see a dramatic shift in the populations as marked by the change of color to red. The vertical oval on the right-hand side of the map is the Drina Valley. And again, you can see the dramatic shift in color represents the restructuring of the demographic landscape from mixed or Muslim majority municipalities into red or Serb municipalities. This demonstrates a successful implementation of the third strategic objective. These takeovers and subsequent crimes forced nearly 400,000 people from their homes. I want to spend the next few minutes focusing on the role of the JNA in this process and the selection of Mr. Mladich as the commander of the Army of Republic of Srpska, or VRS. Long before tensions in Yugoslavia reached a boiling point, Milosevic, General Veljko Kadijevic, Borisav Jovic, and other senior Serb and Yugoslav leaders took steps to alter the composition of the JNA in a way that would make it more favorably disposed towards Serb interest. They did this with forced retirements, promotions, and relocations, thus ensuring that JNA forces in troubled regions had a significant complement of high-ranking Serb officers. One of the reasons the conflict in the former Yugoslavia took so many by surprise was that the Yugoslav People's Army was held in high regard. The people had confidence that it would uphold its constitutional obligation to protect all of the peoples of Yugoslavia, an obligation set out in Article 240 of the 1974 Constitution. The next two documents are examples of how the reconfiguration of the JNA worked, at least in part. Some significant elements of the JNA did consider it to be an army that would place the protection of Serbs above the protection of all ethnicities equally. This document is dated the 10th of December, 1991. At that time, Mr. Mladich was the deputy commander of the JNA 9th Corps, and the conflict had already begun in Croatia. It reads in part, quote, "Our armed forces are entering a new period of exceptional significance for accomplishing the ultimate aims of the war, protection of the Serbian population, a peaceful resolution of the Yugoslav crisis, and the creation of conditions in which Yugoslavia may be preserved for those people that wish to live in it," unquote. While at this stage JNA leadership too hoped that there would be a peaceful resolution to the crisis, it is clear that the JNA considered this a new period of exceptional significance in which the protection of Serbs was of paramount importance. Mladich personally held this view as the excerpt of an article which appeared in the official periodical of the VRS shows. Quote, "A part of our people was blinded by the idea of togetherness, brotherhood, and unity, and lived with the illusions that the storm of war would quickly calm down, which unfortunately claimed many lives. In particular, so in the cities and villages with a majority Muslim and Croatian population, unquote. The document on slide 41 was issued a few months later by the head of the JNA military district in Bosnia, and reveals that the principle of protecting Serbs that we saw on the document on slide 39 was implemented in part through the arming of the Serb population. This document records the fact that 70,000 Serb volunteers were armed by the JNA and the SDS in the municipalities all around Bosnia in preparation for the forcible takeover of the territory. The document states, quote, JNA distributed 51,900 pieces of armament, and the SDS 17,298, unquote. Before the JNA left Bosnia in May of 1992, the Bosnian Serb leadership already started to build its own armed force. Slide 42 contains an excerpt of an address Karadzic gave in February 1992. He says, quote, "That's why we started on another track, a Serbian Bosnia and Herzegovina, our sovereign right, our army," unquote. The JNA participated in the takeover of territory targeted for Serb control to different degrees depending upon the circumstances of the situation and the willingness of particular senior officers. In some cases, like in Bijeljina, the JNA simply allowed Arkan and his tigers to ravage the town despite significantly outnumbering them. In places such as Zvornik, the JNA shelled the city in advance of paramilitaries entering the town. Here on slide 43 is a report from the Yugoslav Army reporting how the Yugoslav Army and the armed units created and coordinated by the SDS have worked.
1 second, please. Mr. Lukic, would you please consult with Mr. Mladic what is...
Your Honor, I think I know what the problem is. Mr. Mladic is asking to have a short break so he can visit Washington.
Then I wonder whether we should take the break of 25 minutes now. Perhaps that would be best. We take a break and we'll resume at 20 minutes to 11.
All rise.